Welcome back, everybody, to our third episode in a series on the Great Awakening. By way of self-explanation, A Foggy Day on Olympus is the place to get utterly dispassionate judgments about history, religion, and culture, and of course, why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name is still Mike Pierce. And in the first two episodes, we looked at John Wesley and other key actors in Britain. But today we're moving our focus to America and in particular to Jonathan Edwards.
Yes, and in particular, too, his most famous or really notorious sermon. This is looking like it's going to be pretty grim. Is this the ultimate fire and brimstone piece?
Yes and no. In terms of content, his sermon certainly was. In terms of delivery, it's not at all how most of us are inclined to imagine such things being given. He spoke calmly, quietly, loudly enough for the congregation, but most of all, he was reading it out from his little booklet. I take some consolation from this. When I preach, most of the time, I'm actually reading and trying very cunningly to look as though I'm not reading.
Yeah.
Because when I put something together, I realize I want to say a thing a very particular kind of way, and I don't trust my memory to keep me going on all of that. And so I do that. So I'm consoled by this. But then again, that's not what you expect from, quote, fire and brimstone preachers. They are ad-libbing from the front and shouting and screaming. And that's certainly not what he was doing. Even so, it did indeed cause a sensation in 1741. And despite all his many achievements, it's the thing that people most remember him for.
Okay, what we're going to be doing is looking at the context at exactly why this had the effect that it did.
Yes. And speaking of context, here's a map for American viewers who may have forgotten since their school days, and for non-Americans who quite possibly never knew it in the first place, how things looked. This map shows a situation just a few years after the events we're looking at, but it was little different to the 1730s and 1740s. So in white, we've got the 13 British colonies on the eastern seaboard there. French-held territory in yellow. French Louisiana was an awful lot bigger than what we think of as Louisiana, to say the least. And Spanish-held territory in green.
What is now Houghton, New York, a place that you and I are both familiar with, at the time it was in French territory.
Yes, that's hard to imagine now, but it certainly was. Although I think that the number of white European settlers was thinly spread, that large areas in yellow, even some of it in white actually, but certainly large areas in yellow, will either have had no inhabitants or those that were simply the indigenous population. Yeah.
Well, Houghton at least carries on that tradition.
Yes, middle of nowhere. Okay, so what about the religious situation in the 13 colonies? It's traditional, and we're going to follow that here to divide them up for most purposes into three main categories. New England, where congregationalism was the established church, but there were also small numbers of Baptists, Quakers, and others.
And congregationalism is, in effect, the church of the early Pilgrim Fathers and the Puritan settlers who came shortly after them.
Yes, that's right. There were theoretical differences between the Pilgrim Fathers and the Puritans who came a decade later. But once they were all in the New World, the theory just seemed stupid. They, in practice, wanted exactly the same kind of church with the same kind of theology. So they become New England congregationalism. And in fact, we discussed this in an episode that we did just a few months ago on the Pilgrim Fathers. Please do go back and take a look at that. Secondly, the middle colonies, so New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, these were religiously tolerant and very diverse. So they were Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed, particularly Dutch Reformed in New York, of course, because it had been New Amsterdam until the British took it off the Dutch. But also Baptists, Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, and other, all in competition with one another for adherents, so to speak.
So these were religiously most like what America as a whole would become in later years.
Yes, the continuity there is much more pronounced. In the case of New England, as we're out to see in the southern colonies, there's more discontinuity. The southern colonies, the Church of England was the established church. So Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, but there were some Presbyterians, Baptists, and Quakers in practice.
Now, these were colonies where religious migration had been really negligible.
Yes, they were political and economic plants by the British. There needed to be a church there, so it was going to be the church of the British establishment, the Church of England, which is not to say that some other people didn't creep in. But again, that's very different because today we look at those southern states, as they now are, as being particularly devout and particularly given over to groups like Baptists. And one general point we need to make here is that the Baptists in 18th century America, although they were present in all of the colonies, were nothing like as prominent as they would become in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, of course, our constant default mechanism when looking at anything in history is to read back the present into the past. And this is another one of those cases. Most of the time, that's a mistake. It's a mistake here. At this stage, they are pretty small. Yes. Now, we need to just look at a little bit of the sort of precursors to the Great Awakening. And there's a number of people we could point to. I'd like to mention two in particular, Theodor Jakob Frelinghuysen, and you've got his dates here from 1691 to 1747, and Gilbert Tennant, a little bit younger. Frelinghuysen was a Dutch Reformed minister who embraced pietism. Now, this is a movement that we discussed a little bit in the background to Wesley and his conversion in the first episode of this series. So anybody not sure about it, please go back and have a look at that. And that stressed the importance of personal conversion. He emphasized vital faith and spiritual experience, not mere religious formalism. And he was particularly active in New Jersey, the Raritan Valley, if that's how we pronounce it. If anybody knows better, I'm sure they'll correct me. And he did something that we associate with the Wesleys. He ordained preachers informally, that is, not according to the prescribed processes of his denomination. And Gilbert Tennant, we should mention as well, he and his father, William, were Irish born, came to America. They were Irish Presbyterians and ministers. They established the Log College 14 miles north of Philadelphia in 1727, and it trained what came to be called New Side ministers, a kind of a new, more evangelically tinged Presbyterianism. And its descendant institution would later become Princeton.
So you mentioned earlier that we discussed this a little bit in the first episode about Wesley, but pietism was basically a sort of proto-evangelicalism. So how did that differ from the evangelicalism that we're discussing here?
I would say the most important difference is that it's less preachy. It doesn't have the kind of hustling tone to it that evangelicals of all stripes, regardless of their churchmanship, tend to have. It's more restrained. It's less finger in your face stuff. I would say really that is the principal difference. Yeah. Not a flattering contrast, but one that needs to be made, I think.
Right.
Let's come to our central hero here. He's Jonathan Edwards, and perhaps this is the most famous portrait of him. And as we've done with a number of our leading characters in recent months. We'll do a quick whistle through his biography so we can get that inside our heads before going into the substance. So he's born in East Windsor, Connecticut in 1703 to a dynasty of congregational clergymen. He was the fifth of 11 children and the only son.
Wow, that must have been an interesting upbringing. But you use the word dynasty here, so maybe you could explain that.
It translates roughly into American as dynasty.
Yes, I suppose you're right.
I'm sorry about that. Yes, I was banking on you to correct me there.
I
That would
would
be a
never.
first. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, it certainly was the case, even more really than in Britain, that the clergy were virtually a caste. It wasn't one that you couldn't break into. George Whitefield came from a very different background and yet became a clergyman. But nevertheless, there was a very marked tendency for the sons of clergymen to become clergy and for the daughters of clergymen to marry other clergy. This had certainly been going on in the case of Edward's family for a number of generations. Yes. Yeah. And as for being the only boy out of 11, all I can say is I'm a little sorry for his father, just as I'm sorry for the mothers of multiple children, all of whom are boys. Cute when they're little, but once they get to teenage, there's a house full of people and nobody sees things from your point of view.
Yes.
Yeah, he was probably his father's salvation in that respect.
Yeah.
Okay, so he studied at Yale, which had only been founded in 1701. In 1716,
So he was only 13 when he started attending.
yes, actually, I think he was just a little bit before his 13th birthday. He'd still, technically, at least have been 12, which is incredible. But that would still have been very young, even by their standards. But a lot of universities back then took students at significantly younger ages than they would now. Right now, it's 18, maybe 19 in some countries like Germany. And if anybody comes in significantly younger than that, it's because there's some kind of child prodigy. That wasn't the case here, although he was a prodigy. 13 would have been unusually young, but not eyebrows hitting the ceiling young. Was, as a student, more interested at first in philosophy and natural philosophy, what we would call science. But he was ordained as an assistant minister to his grandfather, so his mother's father, Solomon Stoddard, in Northampton, Massachusetts, in 1727, when he would have been, 24. 2 years later, Stoddard died and Edwards became the minister. And revival broke out in Northampton in the mid 1730s, with about 300 people in the town converted in a short space of time. And over the next couple of years, it spread to other areas of New England.
Now, what are we supposed to envisage here? Are these unchurched people being converted or nominal Christians who merely attend his church or what?
Yes, we shouldn't run away with thinking that everybody in New England was a Congregationalist to start off with. That would have been the Congregationalists' ideal. They were intending to be a state church. And if we think back to the Puritans who had come there, they believed in a state church, all right. They simply didn't like the one that existed in England. And since they had little hope of things being reformed according to their desires, they left.
Right.
So they did believe in all of that, but that doesn't mean that they attained it, even nearly. Back in the 17th century, they had attempted at least to keep the settlements that they established purely Congregationalist. So for a while, they'd imprisoned Baptists and even hanged a couple of Quakers. But in the end, they couldn't make it stick. By the time we get to Edwards's era, there are a whole number of different religious confessions there, and also plenty of people who aren't meaningfully active members of congregations. Nevertheless, by the standards of what we observe now, levels of public piety were high. So there's a real question about some of these people, and I want to come back to it in a few minutes because now I want to stress here this is purely my own speculation, but I think that significant numbers of them were simply coming to an assurance of salvation
Hmm.
rather than a personal conversion. The conversion will have happened before, although some people of certain kinds of persuasion theologically might want to say I'm making a distinction without a difference. But anyway, that's my own suspicion. Yeah. Now, during his life, Edwards authored a whole load of books on the psychology of conversion. So after this revival breaks out, and we'll talk about this more later on, he was attacked from all sides and wrote a number of books defending what was happening. And that got him to think about how this worked psychologically, about the nature of revival. So partly he's writing to defend them against their many detractors. And late in his life, in 1751, he got into conflict in his congregation in Northampton, so he moved to become pastor at Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And for the last 5 weeks of his life, became president of the College of New Jersey, which goes on to become Princeton. There are, but of course, a whole load of biographies of him. And this one by George Marsden stands out as being magisterial. Yes, indeed. George Marsden is America's greatest living church historian, I think we can say. He's 86 now and thankfully still with us. Has penned a number of absolutely masterful works, including this one.
So, moving on to this sermon in question, he's picking up from Deuteronomy here, which is funny because Deuteronomy is not exactly the first place that most preachers would go for an evangelistic sermon.
No, they would not, or certainly not nowadays. Certain kinds of theology, including Edwards's, tend to conflate the testaments a little more easily than some of us would do, and so they can manage this more easily. But yeah, he's picking Deuteronomy 32:35 here. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. In due time their foot will slip, for their day of disaster is near, and their doom is coming quickly.
What we're going to do next is look at a commentary from Ola Winslow, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian in the mid 20th century. And I know that you think she was a genius.
Yes, I do, and certainly for this passage. She wrote a very successful and influential biography of Edwards back in 1941. That's what she got the Pulitzer Prize for. But then edited a very slim volume of Edwards' key writings, including, but of course, this. And this is from her commentary upon it. So, sinners in the hands of an angry God. His sermon at Enfield, Connecticut in July 1741, preached at the very height of the excitement, was one of the most spectacular chapters in the story. Its immediate publication, together with the reports of the behaviour of the congregation who heard it, added terror to Jonathan Edwards' previous reputation as a revival preacher. Remember, the awakening had broken out in his own parish about 5 or 6 years before. The reputation he still bears in the 20th century, in the thought of those who know no more than his name, was made in that 1 hour in the Enfield meetinghouse.
Oof, that's a sobering thought in itself. Even if you are a prominent person, people might well remember you for just one act, which might not have even seemed especially important to you at the time.
This was something I used to remind my students about when I taught in the London School of Theology. Some of them I knew, I could just tell, had ambitions for themselves as revival preachers or something like this. And even if you do become some big name and you are remembered, it's as like as not to be for something that you did entirely by the way. Yes. And that was certainly what happened here. His subject, eternal torment for sinners, had been preached in every pulpit in America since the beginning.
But since the beginning, that's rather ambiguous. Are we talking about the beginning of Christianity or what?
I don't think it was preached since the beginning of Christianity, actually. Not very strongly, not insofar as I understand the church fathers, no. But certainly in America, since the coming of the Puritans to New England. That's what she's referring to there. So over about 100 years. But in an atmosphere of calm, it had not been prelude to chaos. Jonathan Edwards preached on it at various times. In fact, he'd already preached this same sermon twice in his own pulpit without unusual effect. Characteristically, as he stood before his people on Sunday morning, he chose a positive theme. But on this July morning, he chose to inspire fear. Fear of an eternity without salvation, of an angry God who would take vengeance on those who had lived without him, of the uncertainty of human life that might end any minute, of fire and brimstone prepared for the unsaved.
This point that life might end at any minute, that's still true nowadays, of course, but really life was even more uncertain then.
Yes, it was. It happens, people in New England in the 18th century had the longest life expectancy on average of anybody on the planet at the time, about 51.
Ooh,
Back in England, it was 41. Globally, some places might have been as high as that, and it would go down to the high 20s.
wow.
But nevertheless, everybody was aware that life could end at any minute, that there were loads of people whose lifespans were way shorter than 51. Yes. The fact that he was a guest speaker on this occasion, unknown to the congregation except by reputation, gave him a favourable chance. The fact also that a prophecy was current that the end of the world was nigh was the best of preparation for his text. Their foot shall slide in due time. He had a genius for selecting texts, and this time the choice was oracular. Nothing holds you back from slipping into hell but God's hand, and God is very angry. He may loose his hold at any moment. Some of you will remember this discourse in hell.
Wow. It's that last sentence, I think, that really just plays on the imagination, doesn't it?
Incredibly vivid sentence, isn't it?
Right.
That was enough. Every unsaved man in the house knew he would be that man. 2 centuries and more later, it's still a grim sermon on the printed page. And delivered to a packed auditory under the strain of 1741, it was almost unbearable.
We can just imagine these people jam packed in here side by side. And you've mentioned before that people are more suggestible when the church or meeting room is packed, aren't they?
Yes, one of the 2 or 3 pages that has had the biggest impact on my mind comes from a book that was partly devotional and partly practical, that I read about 40 years ago, before certain people were even an egg. And it talked basically about techniques for spiritual abuse, not because he wanted his readers to become spiritual abusers, but to inoculate them against it. And he goes over a number of things there that people do. And Edwards was guilty actually really only of one, and maybe not even really guilty of that. I don't suppose he arranged for the place to be packed. But I have sometimes sarcastically suggested make sure people are packed in because they're more suggestible. And if there aren't enough people, choose a smaller venue until it is packed. Other things are hold evening meetings. We're more suggestible in the evenings. And other poisonous suggestions are keep changing the emotional temperature of your sermon and the volume because it reduces people's resistance. And after a while of this, they will do more or less anything you tell them to. Edwards isn't guilty of all of this. He's reading from his little book, for goodness sake, and he's not shouting and screaming. But nevertheless, yeah, people are more suggestible when the church or meeting room is packed. What made it so was not only the earnestness of absolute belief for the speaker, as he painted the wrath of God, the pains of fire everlasting, the unending hopelessness of doom, but the fact that the congregation also believed it ancestrally, as it were.
Now, this is an interesting point, ancestrally, as it were. Why should the sermon have made more of an impact just because the people's ancestors had believed in it?
Yes, it both is and is not quite what she's saying. Her point, and it's a brilliant point, is that everybody in their society, everybody they knew, all of the people who knew the people that they knew, believed this. In fact, belief isn't even strong enough a word. They knew it. That's the kind of cognitive status that this had in their minds. And their parents and their grandparents and their great grandparents all believed it. So he's simply going over things that they already know to the very marrow. And that is what makes it so impactful. The unsaved among them had always intended to accept the terms of eternal safety, but as yet they had postponed the day. What Jonathan Edwards was doing as he turned page after page in the little booklet was to make this July Sunday 1741 seem their last chance. Overwhelmed by this sense of immediacy of doom, no wonder strong men clung to the pillars of the meeting house and cried aloud for mercy.
Wow, is this what literally happened?
Them's the accounts we have. Yes, that is what seems to have happened here. This was the incredible impact upon this congregation of this sermon. It was a scene that could not be reenacted in a later generation to whom these preachments would not spell unqualified certainty. Had the preacher confronted his congregation with a new doctrine, such terror could not have been induced. It was the familiar certainty that had won. Now, I'd like to say quite a bit about this, because this really is the core of Ola Winslow's brilliance in bringing this reality out. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, I used to teach church history in London School of Theology, and we had an interesting variety of students. Only maybe a quarter of them were kids doing college. The large majority were older. Some of them were older than I was then. And the average age was about 27, 28, and easily a majority of them had a degree in something else, biology or history or French or something, right? And then we're coming back to do a degree in theology. And there was one kind of category or pseudo category of them, at least in my mind. They were all guys, usually in their early to mid 30s, usually of either reformed or reformed-ish backgrounds, who, if you scraped off several layers of mock humility, actually saw themselves as training for some future point where they would be the oracular prophet holding forth at the front of the meeting house, driving strong men to clutch pillars. And they, in particular, were the ones I was addressing and on whose parade I wished to rain cold water.
Of course.
And using Ola Winslow, as it were, as my instrument. The point I would make is this. that if you and I or those students believe this or anything like this, I'm not specifically talking here about hellfire, I'm talking about the Christian message as a whole, the reality of God, the coming of Jesus, the resurrection, all of this, if you believe it now, then you hold it as what sociologists would call a cognitive minority. Right? That is, you believe it anyway, even though you are fully aware and cannot fail to be aware that every moment all around you, your neighbors, your workmates, the media, the institutions of society tell you constantly that this is all nonsense. Right? You hold it as a cognitive minority. Whereas what was happening in this meeting house was that the congregation didn't just believe these things, they knew them. The point I would make to my students is that these realities don't have the same status in your mind as they did for that congregation. And you're the preacher, right? It can't work that kind of way. Now, at a much milder level, something far less intense than what we're considering here, let's think of something like Billy Graham rallies in the mid 20th century through to, I don't know, the 1970s, something like that. Loads of studies have been done on who went forward when he said, I want you to get up out of your seats and etc., etc. Who went forward? People in the youth group, people in the church soccer team, people on the fringes and occasional attenders, people who were already familiar with pretty much everything that the evangelist was going to say before he ever opened his mouth. And what Billy Graham did was to give a presentation of what those people already knew, gave it an incredible rhetorical shove, and loads of them thought, yeah, that's it. This is what I'm going to do. Now, this is, in a very strong sense, actually biblical. But I'm very far from thinking that this should be normative evangelism. Let me explain. There is one very important event, and people who know their Bibles will already be familiar with it, that looks a bit like this, and it's Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost, right? Where 3,000 people decide all at once that they want to become followers of Jesus. But who are they? We're told they're not just any old Jews, they are devout Jews. So they already knew everything that Peter told them. And if you look at Peter's sermon, nearly all of it is a recapitulation of Old Testament history. They knew this stuff inside out and backwards. But even the last 25%, which is a heck of a lot more exciting than the first 75%, I do have to say, right, which is talking about Jesus, right? They also already knew, because people in Jerusalem had been talking about little else for the past couple of months. And so he's telling them even there things they already know, and he gives it an almighty rhetorical shove, and loads of them say, that's it, I'm in. And mutatis mutandis, what Paul does in the synagogues around Asia Minor and elsewhere in the book of Acts is much smaller scale versions of the same thing. Even if people didn't necessarily know everything about Jesus, they were persuadable of the central realities from the Old Testament and so on. Now let's look at another example, staying with Acts, and that's Acts chapter 17, where Paul wanders into the Areopagus. Now, this is amongst a load of Greek intellectuals, some of whom had almost certainly encountered the Old Testament as the beliefs of the Jews, but not more than that. It had no status in their minds. And so Paul doesn't quote the Old Testament at all. He refers to things that it says, but it held no authority for them, so why should he? The only person he quotes is the Greek poet Epimenides. And his sermon ended the way I'm afraid most of my sermons end, and that is they laugh at him and say, "You're being ridiculous." Because it ran smack up against something that they didn't believe and couldn't believe, and that was the resurrection of the dead. That's the point at which they start laughing at him. If he talked instead about the immortality of the soul, which is a Platonic doctrine, they would probably have said, "Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, we get that. We're all right with that." But he didn't say that. He taught the distinctively Christian doctrine instead, and so they laughed at him. Now, we are told, if you read on what happens immediately after that, he does make converts there, but it's smallish numbers and after a lot more discussion. And later on in the first century, as evangelism carried on amongst people who didn't know anything about Judaism, they were Gentiles, that was normative. Conversions took a long period of time. So it's about social epistemology. How much do people know? And what's happening here is people know everything, at least in the form of the message that Edwards is preaching to them, before he even begins. I'm sorry about that lengthy exposition, but I really think that's one of the central things we need to take away here. And she's making the point it couldn't be enacted in a later generation to whom these preachments wouldn't have spelled unqualified certainty. It was the familiar certainty that had won. So evangelism can happen looking like this, the big meeting, in certain parts of the world today. Sub-Saharan Africa now, not 70 years ago, but now, if I'm not a Christian in sub-Saharan Africa today, I probably have a nagging conscience that I should be. And so when Aunt Flossie grabs me by the ears and drags me into the rally, I may be persuadable there and then to make a decision, right? But if you are living in the secular West, then loads of things about the message are going to seem nonsensical to you. Truth, just one thing is true, not your truth and my truth. Why not? What kind of a tyrant are you? Sin? But I'm not sinful. Morality is just a sliding scale and it can be whatever we want it to be. And in any case, I have rights. I'm a victim. God owes me an apology. Right. So you're going to come up against all of that. It's not
Right.
that conversions can't happen, but they're going to happen over a period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a really important point because I think a lot of people today still want to go with the hellfire and brimstone preaching. And I would argue that it actually does more harm than good, right? Like the number of people who have been scared off from church because the preacher decides to preach this way and they're like, I don't want any part of that. Because you're right, it doesn't make any sense to our culture that becomes increasingly atheistic.
I'm not sure that hellfire and brimstone preaching is the way to go at any point. Some people might disagree with me on that, but that would be the position I would take. But nevertheless, a pretty direct appeal. Yes, I don't have any problem with that where it's likely to work. I merely want to point out that just because it became part of our tradition as a result of the Great Awakening and the 19th century, and at least a fair chunk of the 20th, where it was fruitful in that respect, doesn't mean that it's fruitful now. And there's nothing unbiblical about saying we don't need to do that then. The things are necessary to be done. And this is the why. And I just think that Winslow explains that so brilliantly.
Right.
Let's just finish this passage and then move on a little from there. Nehemiah Strong, who had heard Jonathan Edwards preach on the Last Judgment in his home pulpit, wrote in his diary that without one thought to the contrary, he'd expected the awful judgment to be unfolded on that day and in that place. He'd waited with the deepest and most solemn solicitude to hear the trumpet sound and the archangel call, to see the graves open, the dead arise, and the judge descend in the glory of his Father with all the holy angels, and was deeply disappointed when the day terminated and left the world in its usual state of tranquility.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
we should mention some of the other awakeners. And let's start just by mentioning briefly this man, George Whitefield.
Now, we did look at Whitfield's career in Britain in the last episode, so if you haven't seen that one, you really should go back and look at it.
Yes, please do. He came to America 7 times, and on at least one occasion met up with Edwards. They were a little different because Whitefield was more emotional in his preaching style than Edwards tended to be, and more informal. They're deep in the bowels of my library, and I haven't been able to locate it at once. I've got an account of some nameless person who wrote late in his life an account of how he was converted by hearing Whitefield preach. And he says that he was just working out in the fields one day, and his wife suddenly came rushing across the field to him and said, George Whitefield is going to be preaching at such and such a place about a dozen or 15 miles away, something like that. And without any hesitation, without any delay, they got their pony, they just had the one, and she rode on it while he jogged alongside for about a mile. Then she got off, he got on, and he rode and she jogged alongside, and they kept changing like that until they get down to what passed there for the main road. So these people really lived in the middle of nowhere. And he says that the road was absolutely black with people who were all doing the same as they'd done. They'd heard the news. And they kept going, and finally they get to the place where the meeting is happening, and they all sit down on the ground and listen to Whitefield preach. And he says that was the day that I was converted. And so it was a kind of a major day in his life. Amongst many other things, it's impossible not to come to the conclusion that loads of these people were coming, apart from anything else, simply because nothing else ever happened, where they were living out in remote rural areas, simply slaving away to keep body and soul together.
Right.
And then they heard of this great thing happening. And so they all
Yeah.
came together. And that dynamic is there. We'll talk more about it in future episodes. In later stages of the rise of evangelicalism in America as well, it was a happening, it was an event. Okay, the awakening was controversial, particularly because it created tensions within traditional Calvinism. The first and most obvious point is the emotionalism and the experientialism. Maybe not all as dramatic as in the sermon that we just described, but nevertheless, it's there. And secondly, that it's a challenge to social order and to clericalism, because it's a little unruly, and quite often lay people are being ordained or lay people are preaching. So it challenges that kind of ecclesiastical hierarchy.
Now, this doesn't maybe make immediate sense to us. I mean, what do Calvinistic ideas about predestination have to do with social order and clericalism?
We need to remind ourselves, because there's a tendency to forget with the passing of time, that Reformed theology takes shape in the context of the Reformation. And it is about justifying a compulsory state church to which everybody has to belong. Calvinistic ideas about predestination tell you that you can't tell who, apart from yourself, is saved or not saved. Right? And so that justifies the inclusion of everybody within the church. It also tends to conflate the Old Testament and New Testaments and use the Old Testament as a kind of rough and ready basis for law and upholding social order and so on. So those things are a little weaker in congregational New England, but they are nevertheless still there, if only in the form of fairly rigid ecclesiastical structures. This kind of hurly-burly revivalism is challenging that whole ethos. Yeah. But there's also the implication that one could discern who was converted. Jonathan Edwards says that there are about 300 converted in his own parish. Well, strict Calvinism would have told him that he had no business even trying to guess at that.
So, by admitting that you could tell if a person was converted, you're opening yourself up to the possibility that you could, after all, have a believer's church. And like you were saying, Christianity would no longer be the basis for social order.
Right. Yes. So this, from a certain point of view, constituted in itself a kind of ungluing.
Right.
Now, the Awakeners in the Presbyterian Church were known as the New Sides and split from the Old Sides, the more traditional form of Presbyterians, in 1738. And you have the exact same argument amongst the Congregationalists, particularly in New England, of course, the New Lights versus the Old Lights. So, but also sudden conversions. Now, in the exposition I just gave a few minutes ago, I've suggested that most conversions will be sudden where the evangelism happens in a society where very large numbers of people already know the basics of Christianity before the preacher even begins. They will mostly be very gradual, where most people have major objections to fundamental Christian ideas, which is where we're at now in the West, for example. But, and this is something we'll say more about in the final episode in this series when we look at Charles Grandison Finney and all the disputes around him, on the basis of the Calvinist doctrine of limited atonement, that is, the idea that Christ had died only for the predestined elect, and how could you tell whether you were one of them? In that theology, conversions were supposed to take a long period of time because you are wrestling inside yourself. Am I one of those for whom Christ has died? How can I know? All of that stuff. Traditional Calvinist theology said on a totally erroneous basis that conversions should be gradual. Whereas these conversions, not only are the preachers saying that they know this person is converted, but it's sudden. So that's two Calvinistic stripes against them. What is this? Right.
Right.
Now, as I've said, my speculation is that for a lot of people who have been brought up in all of this stuff, maybe what appears to be a conversion is actually simply coming to an assurance of salvation, because in Calvinistic theology, coming to a place of assurance is extremely hard to come by. The old Arminian Calvinist joke, the Arminian knows he's converted, he's saved, but the worry is he might lose it. Whereas the Calvinist knows he can't lose it. But his worry is he's not sure he's got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this. But also the awakening was scorned by exponents of Enlightenment rationalism, which was already pretty influential in the major towns of the East Coast. So this one's considered irrational and presumptuous and fanatical. So some of the same kind of stuff that we saw actually in Britain.
Now, we talked a lot more about this Enlightenment rationalism and its impact in episode 2 in our series on secularization.
Yeah, that would be good to go back and have a look at that whole episode, actually. Yes. Okay, so let's have a look at this man, Gilbert Tennant, whom we mentioned a few minutes ago, and his sermon, which was pretty notorious, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. But can you see from the title alone that there's tension there with traditional Calvinism? In traditional Calvinism, you can't tell who's converted. Who are you, Gilbert Tennant, to say? Right? He chided those who, quote, are contented under a dead ministry. If they can get one that has the name of a minister, if he's free from gross crimes in practice and takes good care to keep at a due distance from their consciences, that is, he's referring there to the kind of minister who will talk about moral or ethical generalities or spiritual generalities without really closing in on challenging people to where they stand in their relationship with God or whether they even have one. Oh, think the poor fools, that is a fine man indeed. Our minister is a prudent and charitable man. He's not always harping upon terror and sounding damnation in our ears like some rash-headed preachers who, by their uncharitable methods, are ready to put poor people out of their wits.
So, the growing belief, even among Calvinists, that you could tell who was and wasn't converted leads right onto this sort of discussion. You can now say, I don't think this ministry is truly converted, and so they shouldn't be a minister.
Yes, that is exactly what was being said. And of course, that will lead to huge amounts of indignation. Some of it perhaps justified, but a lot more simply because what Tennant is saying in their case is perfectly true and is making them squirm. And so they're getting mad about it. Let's look at one of the most extreme examples of the sort of things that the established ministry will have gone absolutely crazy about. And it's this man, James Davenport. And I'm sorry, try as I might, I could not find a portrait of him anywhere. So he's born to a clergy family in Connecticut. He was top of his class in Yale in 1732, when he would have been, what, just 16 years old. He was ordained by the Congregational Church in 1738. And under the influence of Tennant and Whitefield, he became an itinerant preacher from 1741. So he's breaking away from the kind of establishment background and going completely over to the revivalists. He denounced fellow clergy who didn't share his revivalism. And he often said that he could tell who was saved or unsaved just by looking at them.
It sounds like we can rest assured that spiritual manipulators have always plagued the earth.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, one doesn't have to be a Calvinist of any kind at all to say that this is presumptuousness taken to an extreme.
Right.
And in New London, Connecticut in 1743, he organized public burnings of immoral books and vain luxuries. This is like a latter-day Savonarola. And he threw his own pants onto the fire.
I'd love to know what the problem with his pants was.
Yeah, me too. I don't know. I don't inquire too closely, really. But apparently, one of the women standing by chided him for it and told him he was being an idiot. And maybe that was one of the things that caused him to backpedal later on.
Right.
Let's look now at one of the principal of the Awakeners' critics, their nemesis, Charles Chauncey. And he is born in Boston to a wealthy merchant family, so not from a clergy family. But he was assistant pastor down to 1762 and pastor after that of Boston's first church, so very influential congregation. So he's there for 60 years until his death. And he was strongly influenced by modern rationalism. And from the 1750s onward, he took Arminianism in a liberal universalist direction.
Now, just to state the obvious, Arminianism doesn't have to be taken in a theologically liberal direction, but Chauncey was doing so.
Yes, not necessarily just Arminianism, but free will theologies generally tend to uphold the idea of a believer's church. You can, not absolutely, and not a la Davenport, but at least rough and readily say, yes, I think this person has become a Christian and therefore we'll baptize them. So you can have a believer's church,
Right.
right? But you can also take this in a liberal and universalist direction, say, I think everybody's going to end up saved in the end anyway, and take this extremely optimistic view of human nature. And this is a direction opened up by Enlightenment rationalism, and Chauncey pursues that. And he is savagely critical of the awakeners of all stripes as being fanatical and causing people to suspend their rational faculties and so on. Yes.
Right.
Now, we should consider the aftermath to the events that we've been describing here, because there was a lot of tension with the Congregationalist establishment and with the rationalists. Sometimes the rationalists were part of the establishment, actually. Even Davenport realized that he had gone too far, and he admitted to having fallen, quote, under the influence of an evil spirit. So even where he's retracting his super spiritualism, he's a little bit super spiritual. And he apologized to fellow clergy, but he never fully regained public confidence. He was kept out of ministry for a while, but even when he was quietly readmitted, his later ministry was far less emotional. Tennant sought reconciliation with the old sides, and the Presbyterians, having split in 1738, reunited 20 years later. And Edwards, as we're about to see, published several works, meeting his critics at least part way. Let's just finish by looking at some of those books. A faithful narrative of the surprising work of God in the conversion of many hundred souls in Northampton was written in 1737, so just a couple of years after the awakening had broken out. And it's clarificatory rather than a retraction. So he's still standing his ground. What he's trying to do is answer false rumors that people are spreading about what's going on there, and to explain and describe the process of conversion as he understood it. And he understood that as people striving to be put right by their own good deeds, realizing that this was useless, coming under conviction of sin, realizing that Christ is a savior, and so coming to a place of repentance and faith. And he uses lots of examples from his own congregation to illustrate how he thinks this works. The distinguishing marks of a work of the Spirit of God was written 4 years later, and it was more apologetic in tone. Apologetic, here in the sense of retreating a little, slightly retracting, or at least distancing himself from extremes. It dealt with the frequent swooning and other ecstatic behavior. Now, Edwards's own wife, Sarah, who was a very piously devoted woman, had herself been subject to these kinds of phenomena, but at home, not in turbulent meetings. And Edwards insisted that all of these things were compatible with God's activity, but actually proved nothing one way or the other. So they might be evidence of strong spiritual influence upon somebody's mind in a given moment, such that these kinds of things happen. But it might simply be something purely psychological or internally worked up.
We still have a lot of highly emotional behavior in some churches, especially of the Pentecostal or charismatic sort today, and it still gets criticized. So Edwards was defending this, at least somewhat.
He's defending the possibility of it, but he is not at all denying, in fact, he's freely conceding that a load of it simply could be suggestibility or hysteria.
Right.
Now, I'm old enough to remember, I know you're going to say the resurrection. No, I'm old enough to remember back in the 1990s when a load of this stuff started happening in a whole load of charismatic churches, beginning with the Toronto Airport Vineyard Church and then spreading like wildfire, if that's quite the right word, around the world. And it was quite controversial, even within charismatic circles. Some said, nah, this is too much. This is silly stuff. And I was in a congregation that was quite strongly affected by all of this and felt rather lonely as a skeptical bystander looking at stuff and thinking, nah. But there we are. But wasn't getting hot under the collar about it, to say, oh, this is evil, or this is the devil, or anything. Just purely looking, as I do, at the world with a monocle in my mind's eye. Anyway, this book became a bestseller as an apologia for what was happening, by Guy Chevreau, prefaced by John Arnott. If I remember correctly, John Arnott was the pastor of the Toronto Airport Vineyard Church. And it was defending the ecstatic phenomena of what was called the Toronto blessing. And it made extensive use of Edwards' distinguishing marks that we just mentioned a moment ago. I think the main problem there is that what was being defended was stuff happening in sometimes hysterical, but at least strongly suggestible environments in meetings. Something that was worked up and even systematized, people standing behind you to catch you and all this kind of stuff. Whereas what Edwards was describing in respect of his wife wasn't happening in public at all. This was the intensity within herself from her own spiritual experiences and devotions at home. So I'm not really sure that the whole thing is transferable in quite the way that the book describes, but there we are. That thought may appeal there to some of the more senior amongst our listeners and viewers. And finally, in this context, we should mention his book, Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion in New England, written the following year, and defended the revival's emotionalism and the use of hellfire preaching, partly because of the moral improvement it had brought about in New England. We should mention along the way that his references to Native Americans and the impact of the revival upon them are actually really insulting of Native Americans. Nobody today would read his remarks in that regard with anything other than disgust, I'm afraid. But still, his central defense is concerning the moral improvement it had brought about.
So in this, he is defending hellfire preaching. And we have the proverb, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So does that really make this style of preaching okay?
Clearly, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Not gonna quarrel with that. I'm not sure that really translates to hellfire preaching, because that is fairly demonstrably not what the apostles did most of the time, or even really any of the time, I think, and certainly wasn't at the forefront of what the church fathers were saying in the following centuries. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't make sufficient references to the fact that there is going to be a judgment of God. But I think it's presumptuous to paint in all kinds of details, and I'm not sure we really have a right to do. And a lot of those details are in any case purely traditional rather than simply biblical. I realize some people are going to get very hot under the collar and put down rude remarks about that, but yeah, that would be the view that I would take. But he's also instrumentalizing this. He's saying it's got to be good because it actually brings about a more moral society. And he's probably right that there is a connection. Yeah, I think we just have to leave that one where we find it.
Now, we're at pains to point out in this series that the Great Awakening did not thoroughly transform Anglo-American societies in the mid-18th century. So why does it matter all that much?
I'd want to give two answers to that. Firstly, as we mentioned in previous episodes, it launches modern evangelicalism. What we mean by evangelicalism is the movements coming out of the Great Awakening. And for that, I refer people back to the first episode in that series we did on John Wesley, where we looked at Bebbington's famous 5 descriptors of what makes evangelicalism. And I think that really needs restating and patrolling again now, because the label is being stolen by some very unsavory drifts indeed, right? Which is tempting many people to want to simply abandon the label. I fear that might be necessary in the end, but I really don't want to go there. I'd want to fight for it and say, no, it means what Bebbington says it means. So the Awakening does launch that. But also, and this is perhaps the most important, it has a ripple effect that doesn't come to full flower until the middle of the 19th century. But those cumulative effects are huge, and they truly are society transforming in both Britain and America by the middle of the 19th century. So this stuff is all very exciting. But if we look at the actual numbers involved of conversions, they are relatively small. They are not in themselves society transforming. But their knock on effects, and this is what we're going to deal with in the next couple of episodes, the knock on effects become a bigger and bigger wave that do eventually transform society. As I've already said, 18th century Britain was a deeply unattractive society. And by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, it's something that other people around the world looked up to. And in more recent times, Britons, even of today, have been quite undeservedly living on the reputational coattails of, even after they've long since returned to barbarism.
Okay, what we're going to do in the last two episodes of the series, we are at least going to trace the ripple effects of all of this and see how Methodism in particular mutated, and then how other denominations like the Baptists picked up on the Awakening's message and methods. And then also how new evangelistic strategies emerged, some of which have remained with us really until very recent times.
That's right, yes.
So we hope you guys enjoyed that and hopefully picked up on some new and interesting things. You got a little mini sermon there in the middle from Mike, so that was fun. But we do hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, we would love it if you would share our videos with some of your friends or some of your enemies.
Yes, yes. Please, especially your enemies. Stay with us, people, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Bye bye now.
Bye, everyone.